My husband demanded a DNA test to prove our son was his, but when the results arrived, he was the one who received the biggest revelation of his life. What we discovered in that envelope not only shattered all his certainties, but turned our family upside down in a way no one could have imagined. This is the story of how years of lies finally came to light, and how the truth, however painful, ultimately freed us from a prison we didn't even know existed. Today, I will tell you every detail of this journey, from the moment everything fell apart to the day we finally found peace. And believe me, the path was much more surprising than any of us could have predicted. I was sitting in the living room, my hands trembling so much I could barely hold the white envelope that had just arrived in the mail. My husband, Richard, stood in front of me, arms crossed, with that superior expression I had learned to despise over the past 5 years. Our son Luke, just 7 years old, was in his room, completely oblivious to the storm about to devastate our family. Richard had insisted on that damned DNA test because, according to him, Luke looked nothing like him. And for months he had accused me of betrayal, of destroying our family, of making him look like a fool. Every word that came out of his mouth was like a stab. Every accusation was poison he poured over me in front of his mother-in-law, his friends, even in front of Luke himself. I had agreed to take the test not because I had anything to hide, but because I was exhausted from trying to prove my innocence to a man who had already condemned me without trial. Now, the envelope was there, in my hands, and I could feel its weight as if it were made of lead. Richard stepped forward and snatched the paper from my hand with a sharp movement, his eyes gleaming with that arrogant confidence of someone absolutely sure they are right. He tore open the envelope in a hurry, almost ripping the paper inside too, and began to read aloud, expecting to find confirmation of all the lies he had spread about me. But as his eyes scanned the lines of the result, I saw something I had never seen on his face before. The color draining, his jaw dropping, his hands beginning to tremble exactly as mine had trembled moments earlier. The silence that filled the room was deafening, and I could hear my own heart pounding in my chest like a war drum. Then he looked at me, and for the first time in years, I saw fear in his eyes, genuine fear and pure terror, because what was written on that paper was not what he expected. It was not even close to what any of us could have imagined. Before we continue with the rest of this story, I need to pause to thank each of you who are here now, listening to my story and dedicating your time to understand what I've been through. If you are enjoying this content and want to continue following real stories like this, stories of overcoming, of pain, but also of new beginnings and hope, I ask that you subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell so you don't miss any new videos, and leave your like below so that more people can find these stories and perhaps identify with them. I created this channel because I believe that sharing our experiences, however painful they may be, can help others going through similar situations to feel less alone, to find strength to move forward, and to realize that there is always a way out, even when all seems lost. Every story I tell here is a testament that life can change, that we can rise again even after the worst falls. So please, subscribe, activate the bell, leave your like, and let's continue this journey together. Now, let me go back to that moment in the living room with Richard holding that paper, because what happened next changed everything. Let me go back to the beginning of it all, so you understand how I reached that moment of despair in the living room. I met Richard 12 years ago at a mutual friend's party, and he seemed to be everything I had ever dreamed of: attentive, funny, ambitious, with that smile that lit up any room. In the first few months of dating, he treated me like a princess, took me to romantic dinners, sent me flowers at work, introduced me to his family with such pride that I truly believed I had found my partner for life. His mother, Mrs. Teresa, was polite to me at first, but I already sensed a certain distance, as if she was constantly evaluating me, looking for flaws, waiting for me to make a mistake. We got married 2 years later in a beautiful ceremony that seemed straight out of a fairy tale. And in the first years of marriage, everything seemed perfect, or at least that's what I forced myself to believe. Richard worked hard as a sales manager, and I was an elementary school teacher. Our life was simple but comfortable, and when I found out I was pregnant with Luke, I thought our family was finally complete. But it was precisely after Luke was born that everything began to change, slowly and cruelly. Richard started working later and later, coming home tired and irritable, barely glancing at the baby crying for his father's attention. I tried to understand. After all, he was under pressure at work, trying to secure our financial future. But as the months passed, the distance between us only grew. Mrs. Teresa started coming over more often, always with subtle comments about how I was raising Luke, saying I pampered him too much, that I didn't know how to be firm, that a good mother wouldn't let a child cry so much. Richard never defended me. In fact, he started agreeing with his mother, saying I was too soft, that I needed to be stricter with our son. Little by little, I realized that no matter what I did, it would never be enough for that family. When Luke was 3 years old, Richard started making strange comments about the boy's appearance, saying he didn't take after him at all, that his eyes were different, that the shape of his face wasn't like anyone in his family. At first, I thought they were just silly observations. After all, children change a lot as they grow, but the comments became increasingly frequent and venomous. Mrs. Teresa fueled these suspicions, always saying things like, "It really is strange. None of our babies were born with that skin tone." Or, "In our family, everyone has a thin nose. Where did that nose come from?" I tried to argue that Luke also had characteristics from my family, that genetics are a complex and unpredictable thing, but no one wanted to listen to me. Richard started treating me with coldness, with distrust, questioning me about every minute I spent outside the house, wanting to know where I was, who I was talking to, rummaging through my phone when I was sleeping. The intimacy between us faded. He barely touched me, and when I tried to talk about what was happening, he would explode, saying I was crazy, that I was imagining things. But I wasn't imagining. I felt every day the transformation of the man I loved into a cold, cruel stranger who silently accused me of something I had never done. Things worsened drastically when Luke started school and Richard began spreading his suspicions to other people. He told his friends he doubted his paternity, made tasteless jokes at family gatherings, and Mrs. Teresa never missed an opportunity to spread venom throughout the neighborhood. I became the adulterous woman in everyone's eyes, even without any proof, without any foundation. merely based on the paranoia of a man who couldn't accept that his son simply had different physical characteristics. My own parents found out about the rumors and were devastated. My father even asked me if it was true, and the pain I felt seeing the doubt in his eyes was indescribable. I begged Richard to stop it. I begged him to take the damned DNA test once and for all and end that torture. But he refused, saying he wasn't going to spend money on it, that he already knew the truth. I then realized that he didn't want the truth. He wanted to maintain that power over me, that narrative where I was the villain and he was the poor, betrayed victim. For 5 years, I lived in that hell, being humiliated, isolated, emotionally destroyed, while trying to be the best mother possible for Luke, who fortunately was too young to fully understand what was happening around him. The moment that changed everything happened on a Sunday afternoon, 3 months before that scene in the living room with the envelope. I was in the kitchen preparing lunch when I heard Richard talking on the phone in the backyard, and something in his tone of voice made me stop what I was doing and pay attention. He was speaking softly, almost whispering, with a gentleness in his voice he hadn't used with me in years, saying things like, "I miss you too," and "we'll sort this out soon and can be together for real." My heart froze. My hands stopped in mid-air, holding the knife I was using to cut vegetables. And in that instant, something inside me simply broke, but not in the way it had broken before. This time, it wasn't despair or sadness I felt. It was a cold, crystalline clarity, an absolute understanding that all of it, all the accusations, all the cruelty, all the campaign to destroy me had a very specific purpose. Richard was having an affair, and he needed me to be the villain of the story to justify what he was doing, so that when he finally left me, everyone would believe he was the victim, that he had every right to seek happiness away from his betraying wife. That night, after Richard fell asleep, I took his phone and found everything I needed. Passionate messages with a woman named Marcy, intimate photos, conversations about future plans where I simply didn't exist. They had been together for almost 2 years, starting shortly after Richard began his accusations about Luke. More than that, I discovered messages between Richard and his mother where Mrs. Teresa advised her son to gather proof of betrayal so he could get everything in the divorce. They had even discussed the possibility of him losing custody of Luke because of my supposed infidelity. The rage that consumed me at that moment wasn't hot and explosive. It was cold and calculated, a fury that gave me focus instead of blinding me. I took photos of everything, saved conversations, documented every piece of evidence I found, and made a decision right there in the dark of our bedroom while the man I had loved slept beside me with no idea what was coming. I was no longer going to be the passive victim in this story. I was going to become the protagonist of my own liberation. In the following days, I began to act with surgical precision. First, I sought out a family law attorney, an incredible woman named Miss Paula, who had a reputation for being relentless in complicated divorce cases. I showed her all the evidence I had collected, recounted the entire story of the baseless accusations, the public humiliation, the emotional abuse I had suffered. She advised me to document everything, every malicious comment, every accusation, every witness who could confirm the treatment I received. I started recording conversations where Richard accused me, saved messages from Mrs. Teresa making insinuations about my fidelity, collected testimonies from neighbors who had heard the arguments. But the most important move was when I finally confronted Richard and demanded that he take the DNA test he talked so much about but never had the courage to undergo. I knew he would resist, but this time I didn't accept refusals. I said that if he truly believed what he was saying, he had a moral obligation to prove it, and if he refused, I myself would tell everyone that he was a coward who was afraid of the truth. Richard was cornered, because if he refused the test now that I was publicly demanding it, everyone would see that he was bluffing, that he never had any real proof of anything. He agreed to take the exam, but I could see in his eyes that arrogant confidence, that absolute certainty that the result would confirm his suspicions and finally destroy me for good. What he didn't know was that I had already talked to my parents, already warned my close friends about what was happening, already started rebuilding my support network that had been systematically destroyed over the years. I also talked to the principal of the school where I worked, explained the situation, and asked her to be prepared for what might happen. Every piece of my plan was being put into place. Every move was calculated. And while Richard thought he was about to have his great victory, he had no idea he was walking straight into a trap he himself had built. I had finally understood that the best revenge would not be to scream or make a scene. It would simply be to let the truth do its work, to let his own lies and his own betrayal destroy him in the same way he had tried to destroy me. The execution of my plan began on the same day we scheduled the DNA test at the lab. While Richards thought that would be the day of my final judgment, I was initiating my liberation. The night before the test, I called my sister Amanda, who lived in another city and was also an attorney, and asked her to come visit me in the next few days under the pretense of catching up. Amanda had always been my ally. She never believed the lies Richard spread, and when I told her everything I had discovered, all the evidence I had collected, she was furious, but also impressed by my strategy. On the day of the exam, the three of us went to the lab. I, Richard, and Luke, who thought it was just another routine medical visit. Richard was beaming, talking to everyone at the lab about how he was finally going to resolve an important matter in his life, making sure to insinuate to the receptionists that he had doubts about his paternity. I let him talk, let him expose himself, let him build his own victim narrative in front of strangers. What he didn't know was that I had already spoken with the lab manager, discreetly explained the abusive situation I was living in, and asked that when the results were ready, she call me first before sending them by mail. In the 2 weeks it took for the results to be ready, I executed every step of my plan with millimeter precision. First, I discreetly rented a small apartment near the school where I worked, using money I had secretly saved over months by selling some jewelry my grandmother had left me. Richard had no idea about this financial reserve because he never cared what I did, as long as the house was clean and food was on the table. I gradually began transferring my most important belongings to this apartment: clothes, family photos, Luke's favorite toys, everything of sentimental value. My sister Amanda came to stay for a few days, And her presence made Richard visibly uncomfortable because he knew she had never bought into his stories. During meals, Amanda asked seemingly innocent questions about his work, his schedule, trips he had taken, and I could see Richard getting increasingly nervous, sensing that something was different, but unable to pinpoint exactly what. Meanwhile, Miss Paula was preparing all the necessary divorce documentation, including a request for a protective order in case Richard became violent when he found out I knew everything. We organized all the evidence of his betrayal, screenshots of conversations, photos, credit card statements showing expenses at hotels and restaurants on days he claimed to be working late. More importantly, we gathered testimonies from people who had witnessed the public humiliations he inflicted on me, neighbors who heard arguments where he accused me screaming, his coworkers who knew about the affair with Marcy, and even messages Mrs. Teresa had sent to other family members spreading rumors about me. Every piece of evidence was cataloged, dated, and contextualized. I also went to the psychologist I had started seeing months earlier when the emotional pressure was consuming me and asked for a detailed report documenting the symptoms of anxiety and depression I had developed due to the psychological abuse. The doctor did not hesitate to provide the document, even offering to testify on my behalf if necessary, as he had closely monitored the deterioration of my mental health caused by the treatment I received at home. The most audacious move came when I decided to confront Marcy directly. I found out where she worked through the conversations I found on Richard's phone, and on a day he was traveling for work, I went to her office. Marcy was exactly the type of woman I imagined. Young, beautiful, with that confidence of someone who has no idea of the consequences of their own actions. I sat in front of her and simply placed copies of the conversations between her and my husband on the cafe table where we met. Her face lost all color when she realized who I was. I didn't yell, I didn't make a scene. I just calmly said that she should know that the man who promised to leave his wife for her was the same one who for years had been falsely accusing me of betrayal to justify his own extramarital affair. I told her about the lies, about the defamation campaign, about how Richard was using that narrative to try and even take custody of my own son from me. I saw in her eyes the exact moment when the romantic fantasy dissolved, and she realized that she wasn't the heroine of a grand love story, but rather the other woman in a much more sordid and manipulative plot. Before leaving, I made it clear that she would be called as a witness in the divorce proceedings, and that it would be in her best interest to cooperate with the truth. Marcy didn't say a word. She just sat there, holding the printed sheets with her own messages, finally facing the reality of what she had gotten herself into. So, we return to that moment in the living room with Richard holding the DNA test envelope, and I will finally tell you what was written on that paper that changed everything. Richard read the result aloud, his voice trembling in a way I had never heard before. And the words that came out of his mouth were like an earthquake that destroyed the entire foundation of lies he had built. The test confirmed with 99.9% certainty that Luke was his biological son. There was no room for doubt, no loophole for questioning. Science had spoken, and the truth was undeniable. But what made that moment even more devastating for Richard was the second page of the result, which included an extended ancestry test I had specifically requested from the lab. It explained in scientific detail why Luke had some different physical characteristics. He had inherited recessive genes from both my family and Richard's own family, genes that had skipped generations and manifested in our son in ways that simply weren't visible in the parents, something completely normal and scientifically documented. Richard read all of it in silence, and I saw the exact moment reality hit him like a high-speed train. He had destroyed our family, had tortured me for years, had spread venomous lies everywhere, all based on absolutely nothing, on unfounded paranoia, on complete ignorance of how genetics work. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Then I stood up, walked over to where he stood like a statue, took the paper from his hand, which hung motionless in the air, and said with a calm that even surprised me, "Now that it's proven you lied about everything, that you destroyed my reputation for no reason, without any proof, I think it's time we talk about other truths that need to come to light." I took my bag and began to pull out the printed copies I had prepared, all the conversations between him and Marcy, all the photos, all the bank statements, everything organized chronologically with dates and times. I placed everything on the coffee table very slowly, letting him see each page, each proof of his own betrayal. Richard stood paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing without being able to form words, his eyes frantically scanning those pages as if searching for a way to deny the undeniable. Then he tried to do what he always did: attack. He took a step towards me with clenched fists and shouted that I had no right to go through his things, that I had invaded his privacy, as if somehow I were the villain for discovering the truth about his lies. But this time, I didn't back down. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I took a step forward too, and said loudly and clearly, "You spent 5 years accusing me of betrayal, humiliating me in public, destroying my reputation, threatening to take my son from me, and now you want to talk about privacy? Now you want to play the victim?" It was at that moment that my sister Amanda came out of the room where she had been waiting as arranged, and with her came Miss Paula, my attorney, whom I had asked to witness the confrontation in case Richard became violent. Their presence in the room completely changed the dynamic. Richard instantly realized that this was not an accidental discovery. It was a planned operation, a trap he had fallen head first into because of his own arrogance. Miss Paula formally introduced herself and placed the already prepared divorce papers on the table, along with copies of all the evidence we had collected, including witness testimonies, my psychologist's report, and even a signed statement from Marcy, who, after our conversation, had decided to cooperate fully, admitting to the affair and confirming that Richard had planned to use the false accusations against me to gain an advantage in the divorce. Richard tried to argue, tried to say it was all a misunderstanding, that he could explain. But Miss Paula interrupted him and calmly explained that he had two options: accept an amicable divorce on the terms we were proposing, which included shared custody of Luke with weekly alternation, a fair division of assets, and moderate child and spousal support, or face a litigious process where all that evidence would be presented in open court, where his reputation would be destroyed in the same way he had destroyed mine, where he would face accusations of defamation, psychological abuse, and parental alienation. More than that, she made it clear that we had enough evidence to also prosecute Mrs. Teresa for defamation and slander, as she had been instrumental in spreading the lies about me. The mention of his mother was the final blow. Richard practically collapsed onto the couch, head in his hands, finally understanding that he had lost everything. Control over me, the narrative he had built, the future he had planned with Marcy, using the wreckage of our family as a stepping stone. I looked at that man I had loved, who had been my husband, the father of my child, and felt a strange mixture of pity and relief, because finally, after years trapped in a cage of lies and manipulation, I was free, and he was imprisoned by the consequences of his own actions. Today, 2 years after that devastating confrontation in the living room, my life is completely different. And when I say different, I mean infinitely better in every possible way. Richard signed the divorce papers without resistance. He knew he had no choice. And honestly, I think a part of him was relieved not to have to maintain that charade anymore. In the first few months after the separation, the truth about what had happened spread through the same gossip network that had previously spread lies about me. And this time, the narrative was completely different. The people who had judged me, who had believed his accusations, began to seek me out to apologize, some with genuine shame, others just wanting to relieve their guilt. I accepted some apologies and rejected others because I learned that not everyone deserves a place in my life just because they finally decided to believe the truth. The apartment I had secretly rented became our new home, mine and Luke's, a small space but full of peace, where there were no more shouts, accusations, or tension in the air. Luke adapted better than I expected. Children are resilient in ways we adults sometimes forget, and with the therapy we started doing together, he was able to process his parents' separation in a healthy way. Shared custody works well. Richard picks up Luke every Friday and brings him back on Sunday evening. And in these 2 years, he really seems to have changed. Not completely, but enough to be a present and loving father when he's with his son. I think the public humiliation of having his lies exposed was a lesson he will never forget. His relationship with Marcy ended a few months after everything came to light. Apparently, she couldn't look at him the same way after discovering the kind of man he truly was. Mrs. Teresa tried to maintain contact with Luke at first, but after I made it clear that she wouldn't be welcome in my home and that any visit would have to be coordinated through Richard, she practically disappeared from our lives, which was a blessing in disguise. As for me, I became the person I was before this whole nightmare. Or rather, I became an even better version, stronger, more aware of my own worth. I received a promotion at work, became the school's educational coordinator, and started giving talks on abusive relationships and the importance of recognizing the signs of emotional manipulation. Financially, life was tighter at first. Dividing the expenses of raising a child while maintaining a household alone isn't easy, but the support Richard pays helps. And more importantly than that, I have my independence, my dignity, my peace of mind. I don't have to ask anyone for permission. I don't have to justify every cent I spend. I don't have to walk on eggshells in my own home for fear of triggering the wrath of an unstable man. Luke is growing up in a healthy environment now, where he sees his mother being respected, being happy, being in charge of her own life. He understands, to the extent a 9-year-old can understand, that sometimes parents separate, but that doesn't mean he is loved any less. I maintain polite and functional communication with Richard, focused exclusively on our son's well-being, without unnecessary resentment, but also without false reconciliations. I learned that forgiving doesn't mean forgetting, and it definitely doesn't mean going back. Forgiving is releasing the weight of hatred so you can move forward without carrying invisible chains. Looking back now, I can clearly see how those years of suffering transformed me, made me discover an inner strength I didn't even know existed. There are still difficult days, of course. There are moments when loneliness weighs heavily. There are nights when I catch myself thinking about how things could have been different if Richard had been a better man, if he had chosen to trust instead of suspect, to love instead of control. But those moments pass, and what remains is a deep gratitude for having found the courage to leave, to fight, to rebuild. I met other women who went through similar situations. We formed a support group that meets monthly, and hearing their stories, seeing their journeys of recovery, constantly reminds me that I made the right choice. Luke is happy, healthy, making friends at school, getting good grades, and when he hugs me before bed and tells me he loves me, I know it was worth every tear, every sleepless night, every moment of fear I went through to get here. This is my life now. It's not perfect, but it's mine, built on my choices, my values, my self-love that I finally learned to cultivate. And I can say with all sincerity, I am happier alone with my dignity intact than I ever was in a marriage based on lies and control. Now I need to ask a very important question to those of you who have watched until now. I want to know in the comments below, what was the moment you thought everything would be resolved? When did you believe the truth would finally come out? Because my story isn't unique. It's not an exception. It's the reality for many women who, at this very moment, are living in relationships where they are accused, humiliated, isolated, and emotionally destroyed. If you are watching and identified with anything I've shared, if you know someone going through a similar situation, I need you to know one very important thing. You are not alone in this fight, and there is strength to face it. There is a way out of this darkness. Often, we don't know where to run. We don't know who to trust. We feel completely lost. But I discovered something profound during this journey, something that changed my heart forever. In my worst moments, when I thought I couldn't go on, when the pain was so much that I considered giving up, it was my faith in God that sustained me. It was believing in Jesus Christ that gave me the strength to get up each day. If you are suffering, if you feel trapped in an abusive relationship, in a situation that seems to have no way out, I implore you to seek out a Christian faith community near you, to cry out for spiritual help, to place your trust in Jesus. God does not want you to suffer this way. He wants your liberation, your peace, your restored life. Find a church, talk to a pastor, seek that faith, because true liberation begins when you surrender your fears into God's hands. I am grateful for each of you who listens to my story, who cares, who wants to make a difference. Thank you for being here with me, for sharing this moment with me. May God bless each of you. Until the next video.